now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker for this evening, Dr. Jennifer Charlesworth, British Columbia's representative for children and youth. Appointed as BC's representative for children and youth on October 1st, 2018, Dr. Charlesworth has worked in the BC social and healthcare sectors since 1977. From 1980 through 1992, she served in frontline child welfare, social policy, program management, and executive roles within government, and was engaged in formative work on deinstitutionalization, community inclusion for people with disabilities, women's and girls' health, mental health, and youth services. Dr. Charlesworth was a member of the executive team during the formation of the Ministry for Children and Families. However, she left government in 1997 to pursue other projects. She completed her PhD on the power of women's voice in the face of adversity. She taught child and youth care at the University of Victoria, and she further developed her consulting practice. In 2006, Dr. Charlesworth transitioned into the nonprofit sector and became the executive director of the Federation of Community Social Services of BC. During her tenure, the Federation grew in size, scope, and influence, and worked with Indigenous organizations to co-create new ways to support First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and urban Indigenous children, youth, young adults, and families. Dr. Charlesworth also co-led a comprehensive review of child and youth residential care in collaboration with the Ministry of Children and Family Development. After leaving the Federation, Dr. Charlesworth was immersed in developing the leadership, innovation, and cultural awareness of the community-based social care sector. She is the founder of the Leadership 2020 program for the Federation and became the organizational change lead at In With Forward, that's all one word, In With Forward, Canada's first social research and development collective that integrates person-centered social science research and design to generate meaningful social innovation. Dr. Charlesworth has also worked with Chief Wadlili Speck and many other leaders to inspire culturally safer workplaces and services for First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and urban Indigenous staff and people served. Dr. Charlesworth lives in the traditional territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples. She has a PhD in child and youth care from the University of Victoria and an MBA from Oxford Brookes University in Oxford, England. She's an award-winning teacher, author, activist, and a parent of two vibrant young adults who remind her daily of the power and promise of young people. What a CV. I'm really honored to be able to introduce you, Dr. Charlesworth. And now I'd like to turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duff. I appreciate the welcome and I think I'm going to have to shorten that CV, that introduction a little bit, but thank you so much. It's lovely to be here with all of you in this virtual space as part of the Janusz Korczak Medal event and to deliver the Dean's Distinguished Lecture. First, I'd like to start in a good way by acknowledging with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Wasanich people, with close cultural ties to Lekwungen peoples and the Sanghees and Esquimalt nations. I'd also like to honor the presence of our Lieutenant Governor, Her Honor Janet Austin, a friend and a colleague and an inspiration for many years. It's lovely to see you, and thank you for your offers of support and the way in which you lift up and honor the work in the social care sector. I'd also like to thank my fellow distinguished presenters this evening, Dr. Blythe Frank, Dr. Anton Grunfeld of UBC's Faculty of Education, Lillian Borax Nemitz and Jerry Nussbaum of the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada. Always lovely to spend time with you, even if not in person. And of course, tonight's award recipients, Dr. Kimberly Schoenert-Reichel and Kaylee Burton. I want to thank you all for attending. Doing it virtually is different, but no less meaningful. So I'm honored to spend this time with you to both honor Kim and Kaylee's work and to situate the many contributions made and contributions to come in the context of children's rights and well-being and the significant ways in which Dr. Korczak has influenced contemporary thinking and practice. So I'm a child and youth care practitioner. I entered into this field over 4 decades ago, and in my formative years, it was instilled in me that my job was first to respect, honor, and advocate for the young people in my care. Now, this might not seem too provocative now, but at the time, in the 70s and early 80s, there were still prevailing beliefs about the problems of the child being inherent in the child, that the child needed to be fixed, that we could apply rewards and punishments and controls to manage and shape behavior. This was also the height of the 60s scoop era, with erasure and assimilation a goal and where institutional environments were the norm. So where did this profound teaching about respect, honor, rights, and advocacy come from? Well, we were a nascent field, trying to find our way and contribute something unique and meaningful. And the leaders, teachers, and practitioners that I was fortunate enough to learn from had lived with children, walked alongside them, cared for them, and they knew that we could do better. One of my professors was Dr. Jim Anglin, and he introduced us to the ideas and practices of Dr. Janusz Korczak. His Children's Republic, the centering of child voice, the idea that children must be respected and loved, treated as partners and friends, and especially that each child must be respected as a thinking and feeling human being. Now, these views were groundbreaking in the 80s here, but think of just how extraordinary they were in the 1930s and 1940s. Just think about how ahead of his time Korczak was, given common societal ideas in Western cultures at the time about the role and proper place of children. In that context, Korczak was a true trailblazer, a person in whose path we follow today, even if we don't know it. Learning about him was one of those moments when the light went on, when I was not only totally inspired by what I heard, but also could see and feel the truth and value of what Korczak believed and stood for in my own journey. This aha moment was long before we had a national association to recognize and promote Korczak's philosophies, and long before his ideas were known in mainstream practice. But I've been grateful for that early introduction. I'd like to point out, though, that as leading edge as Korczak's ideas were, they happened within a specific cultural and historical context, and that's part of why they were so amazing. He was rejecting some of the contemporary ideas at the time about the role of children and how they should be treated, and we celebrate that today. But here on Turtle Island, Indigenous cultures had long valued child voice and child rights, and had for time immemorial honored and respected children and held them close, ensuring they had and have a sense of belonging to their communities. So Korczak's ideas were very much in alignment with traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit philosophies around children, and I think it's worth holding that up. The result of Jim's teachings for me was that Korczak's views about child voice and rights are baked into my DNA. They helped me become who I am today, professionally and personally. During his lifetime, Korczak boldly put into practice ideas around the centrality of children's rights. The story of his orphanage, its forced move by the Nazis to the Warsaw Ghetto, and ultimately the tragic and heartbreaking end of almost 200 children's lives, several staff, Dr. Korczak himself, is now well known, but no less gut-wrenching every time we hear it. His commitment to his children was and is awe-inspiring, and his ideas gave us a standard to which we can aspire. I feel so lucky that we have access to his writings now, and my hands up to the Korczak Association, because in this way his ideas are carried on into the present and into the future in his own words. It's a history that deserves to be honored and brought forward in contemporary times. So it's so powerful when we think of his work in relation to educating professionals now. Those who are now studying and those whose futures will involve working with and caring for children and youth in a myriad capacities. Those who will shape and inform the structures and systems that affect children and youth. They may become early childhood educators, child and youth care workers, school teachers, or administrators, social workers, coaches, librarians, therapists, advocates, deputy ministers, or a representative for children and youth. And for each, Korczak's ideas and teachings, the ways of thinking about and relating to young people can and should play a primary role. As we navigate the tumultuous era we now find ourselves in, a key question arises: how are we preparing those who will be working with children and youth in a rights-based way and with a rights-based mentality? What's being called for in this uncertain time? Korczak's ideas about child rights might have been unusual or even ignored or disparaged in his time, but they've gained strong credibility in the years since. In the course of my career and many of yours, we've seen the development and implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, informed by his work, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's been a movement to understand and appreciate a rights-based lens, and that's so exciting to see. But these are frameworks, they're guidelines. It's essential we have them, but we have to go further. What it really comes down to is, how do we operationalize this? How do we turn these guidelines into reality in the lives of children and youth? Korczak was particularly keen on elevating child voice. So Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which states that children have a right to voice their own opinion and to be listened to by adults and taken seriously, probably would have been Article 1 for him. In his words, the first indisputable right of a child is to articulate their own thoughts and take an active role in our discussions and verdicts about them. My office, the Office of the Representative for Children and Youth, is a rights-based organization. And that means that child rights are at the center of our practice. The people who come to work for us, or who work for the ministry, or who work in any capacity directly with children, need to have that child-centered orientation that honors the child, just as he did. So what needs to happen? What should we be doing in order to ensure that future practitioners have a really strong sense of how to honor the child, love the child, and honor the child's voice? So I think there are 4 things that I wanted to share. So first is to nurture the capacity to listen, observe, understand, and be humble in the presence of a child. He was a keen observer and documenter of children's ways of being. He stayed curious, open, receptive. He created places of safety, and he was trustworthy. Second is, we have a responsibility to realize that our responsibility as a practitioner is to infuse child rights and voice throughout our practice, whatever that is, and to understand child's rights, the scope of those rights and the influence that we can have, and most significantly, to actively advocate at every time and opportunity to center child rights and child voice and lift up the well-being of our children. We need to make sure that those who work with or who will be working with children understand their responsibility to place child well-being, rights, and voice at the center of our practice. Sounds simple, but it's easy to be led away from that. There are so many scenarios that can arise. So here's an obstacle. We lose our way and we center systems rather than children. There are a lot of good people with good hearts working in the systems of care. They have clear intention of doing good work. I acknowledge and respect that and have no intention of diminishing it. And in fact, I have the privilege of seeing good work all the time. But systems are powerful detractors from child-centered work. What happens if you're a frontline worker striving to be child-centered and you're asked to do something that's the opposite of child-centered to protect the organization? That can happen. We see it in my office, and I can tell you that it's one of the functions of our advocates to ensure that the child is put back at the center, that the child's voice is heard, so that all decisions that are made are truly made with the best interest of the child at the forefront. If a practitioner isn't firmly grounded in child-centered practice, that kind of situation can be stressful as they grapple with what they do and could have a negative outcome. So first and foremost, it's essential to ensure future practitioners understand that the core of their practice is and will always be child rights-based. They must always ensure they have both ears open to each child's voice. We know we're going to get challenged, but we have to be prepared for that. When a practitioner has a firm understanding of who they are, why they're there, and child's right, they're in a much better place to enact the resistance that's necessary when those pressures come, and to find ways to center the child or youth. It's also really important that practitioners of all sorts will be recognized that they're in positions to have a great influence on children and youth. One of the other early teachers that I had, Dr. Penny Perry, talked about never underestimating a moment with a child. So it's important that we recognize how we engage and how we can be totally conversant with child's rights. We have a responsibility to uphold conventions, but they have to be more than aspirational. We can't fulfill them unless we know them and understand what they mean, why they're necessary, and the histories that necessitated them and brought them into being. So it's important that as practitioners, we recognize how we can shape and how our responsibilities to shape children and youth and perceive and understand their own rights and their own sense of identity and being. That ability to have impact is so important, must be consciously, deliberately, and intentionally contemplated. Those who will work with children need to think about how they want to present themselves and their core values around child rights to children and youth, because this is vitally important. This is true for all of us in the child serving field. Whether we know it or not, children and youth are watching us. They're looking and listening and deciding whether we're models whose actions they may want to incorporate into their own lives as they discover who they are. So the outlooks and attitudes of practitioners are important. And that leads to the third point that I think is crucial to reinforce with those who aspire to work with children and youth, and that's advocacy. In Betty Jean Lifton's beautiful book, The King of Children, she recounts a conversation that she had with Misha, who was one of the last surviving orphans to see the good doctor alive. And he said, you know, everyone makes so much of Korczak's last decision to go with the children to the train, but his whole life was made up of moral decisions. The decision to become a children's doctor, the decision to give up medicine in his writing career to take care of poor orphans, the decision to go with the Jewish orphans into the ghetto. As for that last decision to go with the children to Treblinka, it was part of his nature. It was who he was. And Korczak himself said, I am a person concerned above all else with the problem of uplifting the lives of children. His advocacy sets the bar high. Those who aspire to work with children and youth need to know that advocacy is not a part-time job. It's not something we turn on or off. It's a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week calling that requires moral courage. A colleague and teacher for whom I have great respect, Vicki Reynolds, often says that in our careers, we need to consider where we can be most useful, or as she says, what's the best use of me? We need aspiring practitioners to consider that question themselves. But before they can answer it, we need to give them a real sense of what advocacy is and looks like so they know what they're getting into. To advocate in one's work for child rights and child voice means to take every opportunity to center the child and promote their interests. It means to structure safety for young people into every interaction, to continually monitor whether one is upholding their values of child-centered practice. It means leaning into and living into Korczak's teachings. I know that people who are attracted to work in service of young people are often passionate about their professions. They're sincere, full of empathy, and these are admirable traits. But let's prepare them for the obstacle too, because advocacy also means getting uncomfortable or getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It can mean having one's ideas challenged, sometimes in ways we don't anticipate, and especially by young people themselves, as Korczak himself recounted in an early foray into group care at a summer program where he began to formulate his approaches. He said, I was not a novice in the educational field. I'd been tutoring for years and read numerous books on child psychology, yet there I was, helpless, confounded by the mystery of the collective soul of a children's community. He'd been exposed, as he said, as a counterfeit coin. Of course, this is something we all face as people who care. As he said, you will go on blundering, for only he who does nothing avoids errors. In frontline practice, advocacy can sometimes be harder than it looks. We can educate practitioners to honor child voice, but what happens when there are obstacles, when the theory doesn't line up neatly with the practice? What do you do when you elevate a child or youth's voice, when you center and prioritize their voice, and then they say something you don't agree with? They believe strongly in it. They're bound and determined. Up and coming practitioners need to know what to do when this happens, because of course it does happen. We see this in my office on a regular basis. They have their own ideas about things, as they should, but they may not have a lot of experience or much of a frame of reference. So we may think we know more than they do. They may come up with something and we may think, ooh, that's not good. We need to protect you from that. We may feel a responsibility to be the protector, or perhaps a fear that the child doesn't understand what they're saying. We may feel a fear that they might come to harm. It can be uncomfortable to face these kinds of situations. Those of you who work with children and youth, those of you who are parents, those of you who love children and youth know what I mean. But we're committed to child voice and child rights. So what do we do? Well, these moments are actually opportunities. And Dr. Korczak addressed this conundrum. He said, this relationship between adults and children must never have the character of a struggle for authority and rights. Caregivers have an obligation to skillfully arrange conditions under which children may freely develop in the fullness of their rights. I suspect that if we could ask him, he'd say this principle applies equally to practitioners who work with children. When this happens, it's time to take a step back and look at the larger picture. We need to ask, what is it that we want to achieve for this young person in the long view? We're trying to help them discover themselves, to know who they are, get a footing in life, to understand their own sense of direction, and to be able to speak up and use their own voice. We want to help them realize their potential. We want them to feel like they've heard and they're valued, and to know that they have the ability to articulate what matters to them, even if there needs to be some negotiation. We may need to say, I hear you, I understand. As an adult, here's what I think is important, but I'm not going to leave you behind. We're going to walk along together, listening to one another, and I'm here for you every step of the way. This is part of everyday practice at my office, and I'm so proud of our advocates and investigators and analysts who are so committed to child voice and so skilled at centering in on a new child and negotiating those uncomfortable times and helping others negotiate that too. So what are the results of centering child voice? Well, the outcomes of centering and elevating child voice and of prioritizing child rights can be groundbreaking. When we do this, we start to see children and youth as people, now as equals. Amazing things happen. We need to hear from young people, and we're living in a time of great change and uncertainty. We have no idea what's coming at us next. We're all struggling. We don't know what to do. There is no playbook for these times. Children and youth can see this, and they can sense it. So quite honestly, we stand to learn a lot from them. We want young people to use their voices in important and powerful ways. They are teachers and make our practice stronger. We wouldn't have the amazing young advocates of this world, like Greta Thunberg, like Catherine McParland, if we didn't prioritize and uplift youth voice. These young people can teach us tremendous things, but it only happens when they feel like their voice matters and when somebody has said, I'm listening, I'm here. To listen to young people can be a humbling experience, especially for adults who may cling to the outdated notion that they know better. But young people have wisdom, as Korczak taught us, and it's our place and our role to open ourselves up to it. Take one example, Catherine McParland, whose very recent passing in December we continue to mourn. In many ways, Catherine embodied Dr. Korczak's principles. She was an extraordinary and articulate young person who was able to blaze new trails in pursuit of her goal, which was to end youth homelessness in BC. She did not feel that she had a voice when she was younger, but as she got older, she found her voice. People around her listened. And she fully realized that it was her right, and I think in her mind, her responsibility to speak out for other young people, to empower them and to center their voices. She was a person with tremendous spirit and vision. As a very young adult, she could see the ways to enact resistance to the status quo and to advocate in a sustained way for children and youth. Despite many painful experiences in her life, she was creative and determined to use those experiences to positive effect. In fact, she talked about how our most horrific life experiences that cause the deepest wounds can sometimes become our life purpose. She drew strength from earlier negative experiences and used that to work with young people to effect systemic change. Catherine and her youth group, called Youth Against Youth Homelessness, used the term lived expertise as compared to youth lived experience to describe the wisdom that young people who had experienced homelessness could bring to public discourse. She called it the silver lining of youth homelessness, this idea of lived expertise, and insisted that youth voice must be at the center of all policy development for young people. She released a report through my office nearly a year ago. She called it From Marginalized to Magnified: Youth Homelessness Solutions from Those with Lived Expertise. It was a stellar example of the centering and honor of youth voice. She wanted government to listen to what youth who experienced homelessness had to say, and she assembled a group of youth to hold forums throughout the province with homeless or formerly homeless youth. It was a substantial task that she took on, but despite obstacles, she and her team of young people were undeterred in gathering perspectives from around the province to present to government. She completed her report with the sponsorship and mentorship of my office. It was infused with youth voice and recommended that government develop a plan to address youth homelessness. She took every opportunity to speak up and speak out on youth homelessness and what is needed to resolve it. She understood what advocacy meant and required, and she lived into that vision. She's a prime example of a youth who learned to use her voice and who lifted up the voices of other young people. Although she was tragically taken from us far too early, and we're still coming to grips with her loss. But I'll say this, the example she set for centering child voice and honoring child rights was amazing, and I know that many around BC who had the pleasure of working with her or who were influenced by her aim to carry on that example, including myself and the staff at my office. In fact, as an aside, last year we acknowledged with the Korczak Medal the wonderful Ted Hughes and Helen Hughes hosted by Her Honor, the Lieutenant Governor. And we call Ted the father of the Representative for Children and Youth Office, and we call Catherine our daughter. So another fine example, Greta Thunberg. Dr. Korczak said, "What is this half of humanity which lives with and alongside us tragically cut off? We load them down with the burden of the future humanity's obligations without providing any of present humanity's rights." So extraordinary when we think of Greta Thunberg and what she was saying, that we needed to pay attention to the voices and the leadership of youth around the world who are concerned about being loaded down with the future of humanity's obligations. Thunberg's point is that children's voices are valid and their concerns must be listened to. She's another example of a young person who has much to teach us and who embodies the prioritization of children's voice. She became a household name at the age of 16. She's influenced governments, adults, youth, and children. She drew attention to the environmental devastation that's taking place in a way that no adult could have. The very thing that made her such an unlikely hero, her young age, was also the thing that caused the world to pay attention to her message. These young people are teaching us things we couldn't learn any other way. And you know, this is an especially important time for us to honor these different voices when we face crises such as environmental devastation, a reckoning around racism, political instability in our neighbors to the south, and systemic and structural bias. We cannot think our way out of the situations on our own without the existing patterns, with the existing patterns that we have. Every generation brings new perspective and new hope to these issues. That's in fact what keeps me going. So we actually need the fresh voices and new perspectives that young people bring. Dr. Korczak could see that when so many others couldn't. So someone else who can see that in present day is tonight's Janusz Korczak Medal recipient, Dr. Kimberly Schonert-Reichel. At this point in the evening, I'm not going to speak for long about Kim. She's coming up in the program, but I want to say that I've been aware of Dr. Schonert-Reichel's work for many years. She's spoken at many events that I've attended and has modeled child-centered practice. And in fact, she recently spoke to the Reviews and Investigations team at my office who are currently working on a report about a First Nations youth who died on her 17th birthday. It's a report that's close to my heart and one in which we very much want to honor the young person whose life it explores, not just her death. Dr. Schonert-Reichel's presentation was so powerful that it actually resulted in us thinking about shifting our use of language from talking about dimensions of permanency for this youth to talking about belonging. And of course, that emphasis on belonging leads us straight to the teachings of Dr. Janusz Korczak, who wanted to create spaces where young people felt they belong. I believe it's so fitting that Dr. Schonert-Reichel is this year's Janusz Korczak Award winner. She's been called a dynamo, someone whose passion for her work is so evident, and I think she's an excellent example to look to when we're educating future practitioners in child-centered practice. So I congratulate Dr. Schonert-Reichel on her well-deserved award tonight. I'd also like to congratulate Kaylee Burton on being chosen to receive the Janusz Korczak Association of Canada Graduate Scholarship in Children's Rights and Indigenous Education. Dr. Frank and Dr. Grunfeld, I know we'll soon be speaking about Kaylee, but just let me say that it's inspiring to see a young scholar who so beautifully honors the vision of Dr. Janusz Korczak. So in conclusion, in the difficult times we're navigating now within a global pandemic that has highlighted and magnified inequities, it's more important than ever that we honor child and youth voice and support them to find who they are and to speak their truth. We need to be consistent in our practice, and we need to remain clear about what our values are so that we can encourage those fresh voices that we quite literally need to hear. My office released a report last week about youth who were involuntarily detained under the Mental Health Act. We relied on data, literature, and consultations with stakeholders to identify issues within the mental health system for children and youth, but we centered the report around youth voice. And that's what brought it to life and gave it its power. When we released the report at press conference last week, one reporter pointed out how powerful the young people's stories were and asked me for more. The youth we engaged with for this project are intelligent, kind, artistic, visionary, and witty, and have significant mental health challenges as well. They have wisdom that we need to hear and that we believe government needs to hear. Government accepted our recommendations in principle, and I expect to see changes as a result. These changes will have been led in part by young people themselves. This is the power of child voice. They're leading the way. Thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charlesworth, for your inspiring lecture and for honoring the amazing life and enduring legacy of Janusz Korczak's work and considering ways of carrying forward his teachings, commitments, vision, advocacy, and one of the last words, hope